Tonight, we settle into the golden haze of 10th century Cordoba, a city that once flickered like a candle in the dark, while much of the continent beyond it snored beneath woolen ignorance, while stone castles gathered dust in northern fields, and scribes in distant monasteries debated whether thunder was divine punishment or indigestion. Cordoba bathed its streets in light and filled its libraries with reason. So take a breath, let your shoulders soften, and imagine the soft rustle of paper scrolls, the steady trickle of fountains, and the quiet whisper of minds turning through constellations and ideas long before Galileo ever turned a lens toward the moon. At its peak, Cordoba boasted over 70 libraries. The great library of Caliph al-Hakam II alone housed over 400,000 volumes. For context, that was more than the entire literary output of many neighboring kingdoms combined. While other monarchs kept tax ledgers and saints' relics, al-Hakam II collected manuscripts in Greek, Latin, Persian, Syriac, and Arabic. He paid agents to Rome, Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, even the libraries of Constantinople, hunting rare texts, like some hunted wild game. But behind these walls of parchment and ink were the thinkers. The men and women, yes, women who ran ink-stained fingers over ancient calculations, who spoke the names of Saturn's moons aloud centuries before telescopes, were dreamed into being. One of them was Maslama, a man born not with a telescope, but with an eye for what couldn't yet be seen. Maslama grew up with a question at the edge of his tongue. He didn't ask whether the stars ruled human fate. He asked what ruled the stars, while many in Europe still believed celestial bodies to be stubborn ornaments glued to crystal spheres above the earth. Maslama studied the translations of Ptolemy and refined their equations. He saw the stars not as portents, but as positions, predictable, measurable, real, he taught at the Madrasa of Cordoba, where the air buzzed, not with superstition, but with calculation. His students didn't just memorize, they argued, they recalculated, they observed. The observatory wasn't yet a tower with polished lenses. It was a low, tiled building with an open courtyard and a brass armillary sphere at its heart, ringed with astrolabes polished by years of touch and light. Maslama adjusted calendars, mapped planetary orbits, and even dabbled in alchemy. But his magic was math, and his alchemy was logic. He wasn't alone. Beside him, in the background of most chronicles but never far from the ink, worked Lubna of Cordoba. Often remembered as a scribe or librarian, she was much more. Fluent in Latin and Greek, a gifted mathematician, and rumored by some to be the anonymous editor behind several complex astronomical treatises attributed to her male peers. In a world where women's names were often reduced to footnotes or erased, altogether, Lubna carved her own kind of immortality in the margins of manuscripts. She calculated ephemerides, those complex tables used to track the positions of stars and planets over time. She helped refine astronomical charts imported from India and Persia, translating them into new systems of thought more suited for the clear skies above Iberia at night. The courtyard of the observatory was lit by oil lamps and cooled by the gentle flow of garden fountains. The walls were whitewashed, the sky an open scroll. Here, Maslama and Lubna could stand beside apprentices and students, pointing up toward Vega or Altair, their voices soft against the night air, not in reverence, but in wonder. There was no cathedral to the sky. There was only the sky. And yet, for all their brilliance, the astronomers of Andalusia would remain overlooked for centuries. Some of it was politics. Cordoba's golden age didn't last. By the early 11th century, civil wars splintered the caliphate into smaller kingdoms. Libraries were burned, manuscripts sold, or smuggled, or worse, ignored. But part of the forgetting was quieter. As Europe began its own scientific awakening, much of the knowledge it claimed as discovery had already lived, briefly, in the quiet courtyards of Cordoba. It had been written in Arabic, in ink smudged by centuries of fingers. But by the time those texts were translated, the names attached to them were often lost or misattributed. Maslama's equations were eventually folded into the work of European scholars who rarely cited him. Lubna's calculations were published under male pseudonyms or bundled into compilations with no author at all. Their stars became other people's stars, their charts redrawn, their calendars repackaged. But tonight, we remember that science, like light, doesn't belong to one place, one people, or one age. It bends and reflects, sometimes disappears into darkness, only to reappear centuries later when someone else looks up and wonders. Imagine Maslama standing in the garden, holding a brass astrolabe in his palm, its rings catching the lamplight as he adjusts its angles with practiced fingers. He's explaining precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, to a wide-eyed student, perhaps 17, perhaps older, who clutches a slate board with chalk dust still clinging to their sleeve. Lubna walks by, scroll in hand, eyebrow slightly raised, prepared to correct a miscalculation before it even hits the slate. There's laughter, quiet rivalry, the clatter of sandal on tile, as another apprentice runs to fetch a missing volume from the library. In this moment, knowledge is alive, not a dusty book on a forgotten shelf, but a shared breath between minds, a constellation of thought, each idea orbiting another. And outside the garden walls, Cordoba breathes candles flicker behind wooden shutters, figs soak in honey, musicians strum slowly under awnings as the call to prayer echoes faintly over rooftops. Somewhere, a child asks why the moon follows them home at night, and their mother smiles because the answer, like so many others, waits beneath the stars. As you settle deeper into this moment, remember that the stars above you are the same ones that once reflected in the ink-stained eyes of Andalusian scholars, that long before satellites and software, there were people who knew how to measure time by shadow, to predict eclipses with brass and wit, and to dream beyond the dome of heaven with nothing but parchment and sky. They didn't need to conquer the universe. They only needed to understand it a little better each night. And so they did, one observation at a time. They called it Ilm ul-Falakta, science of the heavens. But for the men and women who studied the sky from Cordoba's gardens and courtyards, it was less about heaven and more about patterns, precision, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing where the stars would be before they arrived. Maslama al-Majri's most faithful student was a young man named Yahya ibn Khalid, who rarely spoke unless asked and could calculate the rising of Saturn faster than most could recite their own lineage. Yahya arrived at the observatory each morning before the birds stirred in the hedges, slipping past the gate with his notes clutched to his chest and a small leather pouch of polished stones tied at his waist. They were not magical, not even particularly valuable, but Yahya used them to map stellar distances across parchment, anchoring constellations with the quiet reverence of a priest, setting holy objects in place. Lubna often watched him from across the colonnade, scribbling quietly in her own right. correcting ancient Syriac translations where Ptolemy had been misinterpreted. Between them passed not only glances and nods, but annotations, diagrams, small corrections written in the margins, and returned the next day improved. They never claimed credit for one another's work. They didn't need to. The rhythm of shared thought required no announcement. One summer evening, as the sun fell low behind the mesquite's towering minaret and the air thickened with the scent of warm jasmine, a courier from Damascus arrived bearing scrolls sealed. In dark red wax, the Caliph himself had commissioned the delivery. The scrolls were translations of Indian astronomical texts long thought lost. Among them was a new model of lunar motion, unfamiliar even to the most well-read astronomers of Cordoba. Maslama spent the night pacing beneath the archways, unrolling diagrams drawn on parchment so delicate it crackled when touched. His fingers traced the curves of orbits that defied the simplicity of circular models, eccentricities, epicycles, something the Greeks had guessed, the Indians had refined, and now Maslama sought to perfect. The next morning, the courtyard buzzed with curiosity. Astrolabes were recalibrated. Scribes hunched over fresh pages. Yahya and Lubna argued gently over whether the moon's shifting speed in its elliptical path was best expressed through geometry or ratio. Lubna favored simplicity, Yahya precision. Maslama encouraged both. For a while, it seemed that itself bent toward the stars. Even the Caliph visited one morning, his sandals silent on the tiled floor as he watched Yahya demonstrate how to predict the phases of Venus. The Caliph listened quietly, his gaze drifting upward, perhaps wondering whether such knowledge could chart not just planets, but empires. A few days later, the observatory received new brass instruments, imported from Cairo, courtesy of the royal treasury. But not all looked kindly upon the night sky's interpreters. In the markets beyond the whitewashed walls, whispers gathered, like dust. Some said that men who stared too long at the heavens forgot the ground beneath them. Others claimed that astrology was a dangerous flirtation with the divine, even though the astronomers had long since rejected portents for prediction, omens for orbits, and a few simply resented the resources being poured into parchment and star charts when soldiers lacked boots. Tensions grew quietly. The Caliph's advisors began asking questions. Who had authorized the translations of Hindu texts? Why were women working in scholarly roles? Why were the names on the new treatises not those of known imams, but of scribes and students? Maslama responded, as always, with diagrams. He invited skeptical clerics to observe the eclipses he had predicted to the hour, to examine the quadrants, and models that made divine order more visible, not less. Some were impressed, others unmoved. Yahya, sensing the shifting winds, began copying the most critical works by hand, hiding second copies beneath floorboards and in hollowed scrolls stacked high in the scriptorium. Lubna, with quieter foresight, began training two young girls from a merchant family nearby Lilla, and Samira, who showed early aptitude for trigonometry and a troubling fondness for algebra. Lubna didn't seek permission, she never had, and still, the stars moved on. Winter came softly that year. The fountains in the observatory slowed, not from freezing, but from disrepair. A crack in the western archway let in a draught that curled the edges of manuscripts. Students began arriving later, leaving earlier. The Caliph, now older and wary, sent fewer couriers, more guards. Maslama held steady. He knew that knowledge passed, in cycles like the stars themselves. There were apogees and perigees, brilliant zeniths followed by inevitable declines. But he also knew that even in darkness, stars remained. So he wrote. He compiled tables of planetary positions that would one day travel to Toledo, then Paris, and eventually be used by Copernicus. He refined models of solar declination that would guide navigators across oceans they did not yet know they would cross. And in the margins, he noted Lubna's corrections, Yaya's refinements, even Leela and Samira's observations on the shifting shadow angles at different times of the year. He wrote their names down not in the body of the text, where future scholars might erase them, but in the folds of the cover, beneath the flap, hidden and protected. Just before his death, sent one final letter to a colleague in Baghdad. In it, he wrote, "The stars are not ours. We are merely visitors beneath their light. But if our maps endure, if our numbers guide another hand in another time, then we have not worked in vain." He died quietly, surrounded by scrolls and silence. Lubna did not weep. She did not stop. She took over the observatory in name, though few beyond its walls recognized her as anything more than a librarian. Yahya continued to teach. Leela and Samira grew bolder in their calculations, and for a time the stars still sang above Cordoba. But history does not always preserve its most luminous chapters. Eventually, the tides of power shifted, and the observatory closed its doors. Manuscripts were sold, stolen, miswild. Scrolls were translated, retranslated, and stripped of their authors. The names of Lubna and Yahya faded from footnotes to silence. The stars, as always, remained. And yet, even now, if you walk through the ruins of old Cordoba at dusk, you might find the faint trace of a brass ring half buried in the dirt, or a tile etched with a number no one recognizes. You might feel the echo of footsteps across the courtyard floor, and if you pause just long enough, you may hear a whisper of laughter from a garden long gone. Because knowledge does not die. It drifts. It hides, it waits, and one day, when the sky is clear and the air is still, it will rise again like Venus in the east, bright, inevitable, and bearing the names of those who once dared to look up. The sky above Andalusia remained, unbothered by the affairs of men. Even as dynasties frayed and the tapestries of power shifted, the stars kept their silence. Polaris still anchored the night, Orion still hunted across the winter sky, and Venus still slipped softly into view before dawn. But beneath that steady celestial dome, Cordoba began to crumble, not in fire or fury, but in forgetfulness. By the mid-11th century, the observatory was no longer a sanctuary. The courtyard tiles grew cold, untended. The fountains that once murmured beside parchment pages now gurgled with leaves. Scrolls sat unopened, instruments untouched, their brass dulled by the breath of time. The students had thinned. Some had left in search of safer cities. Others had stayed and learned to speak more softly, their curiosity carefully measured. Lubna remained longer than anyone expected. Age had silvered the braids she still wore high above her collar, and her fingers, once swift over wax tablets and quills, now moved more deliberately, but her eyes had not dimmed. She still traced the constellations in the sky each night with the same quiet awe, now accompanied only by Samiran, no longer a student, but a scholar in her own right. Samira had grown tall, calm-voiced, with a mind as sharply structured as the patterns of geometric tiling in the palace courtyards. She had spent her early years copying Lubna's work by moonlight, but now she worked on her own treatises, reimagining the celestial equator, refining planetary distance estimates, creating new methods of observational triangulation using only fixed shadows and polished mirrors. Together, they worked in silence most nights, one copying fragments of al-Khwarizmi's star tables, the other annotating the movement of Mars against the changing horizon. They shared almonds, lamp oil, and the occasional memory. In that hushed observatory, they became not just scholars, but keepers of a dying fire. The city beyond their walls was changing. New rulers had come. The Tifa period had splintered the once mighty caliphate into smaller, independent kingdoms. Some encouraged scholarship, others tolerated it. Most viewed it with cautious indifference. The library of Al-Hakum, once the soul of Cordoba's brilliance, had been dismantled decades earlier. Its volumes scattered, some sold, some burned, some buried beneath other languages. But knowledge, once planted, does not always die when uprooted. It waits in the port city of Toledo, to the north. Word spread of a new translation, movementa, strange collaboration of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim scholars, gathering to decipher Arabic manuscripts and convert them into Latin for a rising European intelligentsia. Among the many texts trickling north were unsigned documents, calendars, diagrams, planetary tables that bore the unmistakable structure and language of Maslama's lineage. But their authorship had been lost in transit. Yet name was never translated. Lubna's annotations were rendered as marginalia, footnoted in Latin as from an unknown hand. Samira's trigonometric advancements would eventually appear in a volume printed in Venice, 300 years later, attributed to a Florentine philosopher who never saw Andalusia in his life. And still, the stars moved on. One winter, colder than most, Lubna passed quietly beneath a sky as clear as glass. Samira buried her in the garden courtyard beside the fig tree, where the last petals of a late bloom clung stubbornly to the branch. No stone marked the grave, only a small brass astrolabe placed atop the soiled surface, etched with a single inscription in Kufic script. She mapped the sky. After that, the observatory was truly silent. Samira sealed the scriptorium herself, wrapping the scrolls in layers of cloth, hiding manuscripts beneath cracked tiles, inside walls, even within hollowed furniture. She taught no students. She spoke of her work to no one. Perhaps she knew what was coming, or perhaps she simply preferred that silence to the sound of knowledge being twisted, misnamed, or forgotten. She left Cordoba in spring. Historians will tell you that she disappeared, but the truth is simpler. She walked east to Almeria, first where she studied ship navigation among coastal traders, then to Cairo, where she taught at a school for girls and left behind anonymous pages that would later fuel the observations of astronomers in the Fatimid court. From there, she moved again, always toward the edge of known maps, her name slipping from record. Her work surviving in fragments, one chart here, one translated equation there. Centuries passed. Europe's scientific awakening dawned, slowly and unevenly. Names like Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo emerged, brilliant men who drew from ancient wells without always knowing their depth. Their notebooks bore the fingerprints of Maslama's formulas, the skeletons of Yahya's distance models, the geometry Lubna had scribbled into margins, the angular corrections Samira had whispered over brass discs. The knowledge lived on, but the names did not. They were erased not by malice, but by the indifference of time and translation. Language is a fickle archivist. and history is often curated by the victors, or at least the loudest scribes. Yet beneath the surface of every stellar table, in the footnotes of every astronomical volume printed in 15th century France or 16th century Prague, there remain Arabic numerals, unexplained symbols, small errors that make sense only if you've seen the originals, and occasionally, tucked deep in the archives of forgotten libraries, scholars rediscovered these traces. A note in Andalusian script, a reference to a method attributed to the woman from Cordoba, a symbol that appears nowhere in Latin mathematics, but matches a scratched diagram buried beneath dust in the ruins of an old garden. The sky, meanwhile, remains unchanged. Sailors in the 17th century still used tables based on Maslama's models to cross oceans. Astrologers in Elizabethan England unknowingly borrowed from the ephemerides Yaya once copied by hand. Astronomers in Paris puzzled over star maps whose roots stretched back to Lubna's hands, and Samira's shadow-based triangulation method was eventually rediscovered in a Jesuit text from South America, credited to a bishop who had never seen the desert skies of Cordoba. The names were lost, but their work endured, and so we return to the present, not to mourn, but to marvel, because the stars that once glowed above Andalusia now shine on satellites. The curiosity that bloomed in sunlit courtyards echoes in labs and observatories across the globe, and the forgotten astronomers, those soft-voiced minds who mapped the heavens with brass and breath, still walk with us, invisible but not gone. Tonight, as you close your eyes and breathe beneath the same constellations they once measured, remember that knowledge is not always loud. It often begins in silence, beneath the whisper of leaves, beside the hush of water, in the scratch of ink on vellum, and even if the names are forgotten, the work, the wonder remains, long after the last scroll had been tucked into a shadowed alcove, after the colonnades of the observatory had crumbled beneath creeping vines and time, after even the memories of Cordoba's golden nights had grown dim in the corners of textbooks. There remained somewhere in the cracked breadth of history a question that refused to disappear. Who were they? They who mapped the heavens with trembling hands and unwavering resolve. They who copied equations in the hush of candlelight while empires argued above their rooftops. They whose names were lost in transit while their theorems traveled without. Them, and while the modern world twirled into its age of machines, rocketry and satellites, that question stirred softly in the minds of archivists and librarians, collectors and code breakers. One of them was Dr. Lina Reze, a postdoctoral researcher from Tehran who found herself, quite by accident, in the archives of a small university in southern Spain. Her coat still damp from an early spring rain when she opened a box labeled simply miscellaneous, Arabic, pre-1200. Inside there were only 4 items: a fragment of parchment with an unfamiliar star diagram, a slip of brass inscribed with an incomplete latitude scale, a note in Judeo-Arabic referencing al-Caesar Lubna, and a cracked spindle of cedar that once opened revealed a rolled page written in exquisite Kufic script. She didn't recognize the author. No one did. The handwriting was delicate, elegant, female. There was no name at the top, only a line at the bottom, partially faded, that read, "Let the stars find us." Again, Dr. Reze scanned the page and began to compare the coordinate values listed on its side with known star tables. What she saw made her stop. They were slightly off, not in error, but in method. The model assumed a different center of motion than Ptolemy's geocentric paradigm, not heliocentric either, something in between, something transitional, as if the writer had glimpsed a possibility but not yet dared to name it. She spent the rest of the evening in the archive, surrounded by the scent of old wood and damp paper, chasing a trail that had no map. There were references vague and glancing to a woman astronomer from Cordoba, whose work had once been cited by a scholar in Marrakesh, whose diagrams had found their way into a monastery's translations in Sicily, whose angular measurements matched none of the known European tables of her time. Every trace was partial, every record broken, but the shape of something immense began to form not in a single document, but in the spaces between them, a network, a lineage. Dr. Reze wasn't alone in her quiet revelation. Elsewhere, in a library in Alexandria, a graduate student named Idris uncovered a misfiled Latin codex with Arabic marginalia that corrected its trigonometric errors. The handwriting was a match. Meanwhile, in Istanbul, a curator stumbled upon a celestial globe whose lower inscriptions had been worn nearly smooth, but beneath infrared scanning revealed a faint, etched phrase based on the Andalusian tables of Yoya piece by piece, continent. By continent, the scattered embers of Cordoba's legacy began to flicker, not in headlines, not in grand documentaries, but in notebooks, conference footnotes, and long late-night calls between scholars, comparing notes, aligning dates, trading images, whispering their wonder like secret code. The story they were reconstructing didn't follow the usual arc of genius or conquest. There were no lone heroes standing triumphant above the world. Instead, there were shared efforts, paired observations, disagreements recorded in polite footnotes, scribbles in margins refined by others. A mathematics of collaboration. It was not just Lubna or Yahya or Maslama. It was a whole ecosystem of thinkers, some known, many lost who had chosen, for a moment in history, to look up together. And even now, centuries later, the shape of their unity remained biking Cordoba. Beneath the new cafes and cobbled streets, the foundation stones of the observatory still slept beneath layers of dust and soil. No official excavation had ever been done, but every so often, a tourist would report finding a strange symbol carved into a loose tile, or a brass shard nestled among the broken masonry, an arc, a coordinate, an unfamiliar name. Some dismissed these as decorative, others knew. Better in time, the rediscovery gathered quiet momentum. A grant was secured, a team assembled, and one spring, almost 1,000 years after Lubna had last copied a chart beside a moonlit fountain, a corner of the courtyard was uncovered again. They found no books. Most had been carried off, burned, or buried long ago. But they did find an astrolabe flattened but intact hand beside it, a stone basin whose rim bore 10 small notches, evenly spaced, a rudimentary sundial, or perhaps something more sophisticated. No one was certain. But on its edge was a symbol not seen in any other known archive, a delicate blossom carved into stone, petals arched like the rays of the sun at its center. A simple geometric rose. A scholar from Cairo identified it as a mark used by Samira in one of her treatises. A blossom hidden in plain sight. A signature, centuries late in being red. Excavation continued. What emerged wasn't grandeur. No great temple or library hall, just an open space, a few benches, the base of a broken fountain. But there was beauty in the proportions. The layout obeyed geometric harmonies. The central space aligned precisely with the noon sun at equinox, and all across the site, carved faintly into the surviving stone, were small, repeating inscriptions in Arabic script. We were here, no dates, no names, just a quiet affirmation, a whisper written in limestone by now. The work of the Cordoba astronomers had begun to re-enter academic curricula, carefully, cautiously, sometimes under new names, sometimes restored to their own. Historians debated the accuracy of attribution. Linguists puzzled over eroded texts. But artists, students, and dreamers felt something deeper, a recognition that beneath every star chart lies a story, and beneath every story a heartbeat. The tale of the forgotten astronomers was not one of loss, but of return. Not all rediscoveries come with fanfare. Some arrive like a moonrise, gradual, golden, and quiet. Some are found in footnotes, or etched in the stone of ruins walked over for centuries. Some live not in museums, but in memory, in the moment someone looks up, compass in hand, and wonders how far, how long, how beautiful. And though the names of Lubna, Yahya, Mira, and their companions may never fill the pages of popular histories, they dwell now in the constellation of truth, in the understanding that brilliance is not bound by recognition, that the stars do not ask who sees them only, that someone, somewhere, still looks up. Because, in the end, the stars remember. They remember the hands that measured them, the eyes that followed them, the minds that dared to chart the unknown with nothing but ink, courage, and time. And on nights like these, when the world turns soft with sleep and sky, you can still feel them whispering through the wind, shining from above and waiting, always waiting to be found again. There are cities whose glory is carved in stone, and cities whose legacy lingers like perfume in the folds of forgotten fabrics. Cordoba was both, even after its towers fell silent, even after the manuscripts had faded and the gardens dried. It did not disappear. It dissolved, gently, into memory, and that memory rippled outward, not in grand speeches or gilded museums, but in quieter ways. A formula written in a scholar's margin in Damascus, a child in Rabi learning to plot stars with a paper quadrant, a mason in Sicily carving a compass rose into a chapel floor, unaware that the design had first appeared in a garden far to the west, inked by hands long buried beneath fig leaves and sand. It was in this current of quiet remembrance that the next seeker came. His name was not important, not yet. He was young, with sand-colored hair and a tendency to forget where he placed his pen. He'd been raised in the north, in the drizzled quiet of Wales, where stars were often hidden behind cloud and mist, but he had read of them. He had pored over books in damp libraries and whispered the names of constellations like spells to keep sleep at bay. And one winter, in the brittle silence of his university's archives, he stumbled across a single sentence that changed him. The Andalusian tables record an anomalous deviation of Mars in the year 1061, unaccounted for in Ptolemaic systems, marked by an unknown hand. He didn't know why it caught him. Perhaps it was the phrasing, unknown hand, or perhaps it was something older than language. A hunch, deep in the spine, that the writer had not been trying to impress, only to understand. He packed lightly 3 shirts, 2 notebooks, and a solar compass. He arrived in Cordoba in early spring. The city was alive with orange blossoms and the low hum of mopeds. He walked the alleys where aqueducts once gleamed, followed the trail of scholars before him, and one afternoon found himself before the remains of the observatory. It didn't look like much, just a quiet plot behind a museum, ringed by stonework and half-forgotten plaques. But he knelt, placed his hand on the stone, and felt its warmth, faint and impossible. As if the sun still remembered the fingers that once traced angles here. He stayed, for weeks, then months. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that he hadn't found it yet. He learned Arabic, slowly and awkwardly. He visited second-hand bookshops and befriended an old bookseller named Yusuf, who kept a catalogue of manuscripts no one had asked about in decades. Yusuf had a nephew who worked in Madrid. The nephew knew someone who had once scanned a manuscript fragment from a private collection in Cairo, which in turn referenced a set of lunar equations preserved only in a margin note in Istanbul. One breadcrumb led to another. He no longer slept at regular hours. He charted the moon's phases from his rooftop, murmuring the old names Qamar, Hillel, Beta. He began cross-referencing star positions against the Andalusian deviations. A pattern emerged, small, almost imperceptibly, like the faint beat of a heart beneath layers of dust, and then one night, it happened. He was working late, surrounded by maps and candles, when a gust of wind slipped through the window and scattered his pages. He cursed softly, reaching for them. But one floated further than the rest beneath his desk, behind a trunk, into the hollow of an old heating grate. When he pulled it free, it wasn't his page. It was older, much older. A scrap, torn at the edges, faded with age. But the ink was still visible. A curved star path, a series of notations in both Arabic and Latin, and at the bottom, barely visible, a symbol he had seen once before on a stone basin in the observatory ruins. The geometric blossom his breath caught. He scanned it, analyzed it, cross-checked. Every value. The deviation of Mars in 1061, it matched precisely. And the notations weren't just commentary, they were corrections. Whoever had written this had understood not just the motion, but its root, the underlying shift, the transition between models that would not be formalized for centuries. He took the scrap to Yusuf, who confirmed its script and dating. It was authentic, but more importantly, it was consistent with other pieces, forgotten bits across North Africa, Southern Europe, and parts of the Levant. Together, they began to reconstruct not just a theory, but a voice that had never stopped speaking, only whispering in the dark. He began to write, not a thesis, not yet. First, a letter to the university in Istanbul, to the archive in Cairo, to a professor in Rabi, a translator in Granada, a conservator in Rome. He wrote with caution and reverence, offering his findings not as revelation, but as recognition. He knew the risk. The academic world could be a jealous one, but he also knew that knowledge, like light, could not be contained forever. Within the year, the whispers became conversations. A conference was organized, small, unofficial, held in Cordoba in a borrowed hall, but it was full scientists, historians, mathematicians, translators. They came not to debate, but to listen. He presented the blossom symbol, the star table deviations, the marginalia, the manuscripts. He spoke of Lubna, of Yahya, of the unnamed voice who had first mapped the anomalous motion of Mars. He did not claim discovery, he claimed remembrance. They sat in silence when he finished, not stunned, but softened, moved, because what he had uncovered was not just data, but presence, the breath of minds across time. A few months later, the university approved a formal excavation of the Cordoba observatory ruins. The effort was joint Spanish, Egyptian, Turkish, Moroccan, Iranian, and beyond. Over the next 3 years, they uncovered instruments buried in layers, etchings on stone that formed a mosaic of equations, and beneath it all, a single scroll case of silver and cedar. Inside, a nearly intact manuscript, annotated in 3 hands. One was familiar, the angular script of Maslame. Another, round and flowing Lubna, unmistakable. And the third, smallest and neatest, bearing only initials in Arabic that spelled Samira. The scroll was titled simply Tariq al-Kawakib, the path of the stars. It changed everything, not because it rewrote science, but because it rehumanized it. The manuscript was a collaboration, not a solitary genius, but a woven work of minds across decades. It contained mistakes, corrections, notes of encouragement, even small jokes scribbled between diagrams. It was alive, and in the final passage, beneath a diagram of Saturn's retrograde motion, one line was written in all 3 hands. If they forget our names, let the stars remember us. And they had. They always had. Now, when scholars teach the evolution of astronomy, they include Cordoba not as a footnote, but as a foundation. The observatory is rebuilt, not as a monument, but as a space of learning. Children visit, lie on benches to watch the sky, trace the movements of planets that were once plotted by women in silence, and when night falls, the city breathes again. Orange blossoms bloom, fountains whisper, and in the hush between footsteps and stars, you can almost hear them, the soft turning of astrolabes, the laughter of scholars bent over parchment, the rustle of scrolls opening like petals. They are not forgotten, they are skywritten, and if you look up tonight, wherever you are, beneath whatever sky you sleep under, know that you are not alone. They are watching, still measuring, still waiting, still guiding us. One calculation, one constellation, one quiet rediscovery at a time. Some stories grow louder with time, others quieter still. Theirs had been nearly lost, not by malice, but by neglect dissolved into footnotes, misattributed translations, and the slow erosion of memory under regimes that valued conquest more than curiosity. And yet, like the stars they once studied, the lives of Andalusia's forgotten astronomers had never truly vanished. They had only receded behind clouds of history, waiting for the skies to clear. In Cordoba, the observatory had become more than a relic. It was a living archive now in open sky classroom, a place where sundials and solar arcs replaced blackboards, where whispering guides in linen robes told visitors how this city had once listened to the cosmos with such precision it could predict eclipses with a margin of error thinner than a breath. The project had grown. Universities across continents now sent interns and fellows to study in the Andalusian ruins. Teams of physicists and cultural historians worked shoulder to shoulder, not to compete for discovery, but to untangle the knots time had left behind. Their goal wasn't to make headlines, but to make sense. The past didn't need a savior. It needed a translator. One of them was Layla. She came from Fez, carrying her grandmother's worn telescope and a voice that was always 2 shades above a whisper. She specialized in medieval optics, how light passed through glass before lenses were shaped by modern hands. It was Layla who first noticed the strange curvature on a recovered shard of crystal, unearthed from the far western wing of the Cordoba site. It was an ocular lens, primitive but precise. Etched faintly on its rim were 3 dots, aligned with a 4th configuration unknown in known European designs of the 11th century. But in one manuscript preserved in Cairo, she had read of such a formation. The eye is a prism, and knowledge bends through it. She compared the fragment's angle with written calculations in Tariq al-Kawakib, and they matched. The lens had been ground to account for atmospheric distortion, not just magnify. It was a correction centuries ahead of its supposed time. And in the margin of that same manuscript was a single line that made her breath catch. For the eyes that will come after us, may we leave clearer skies. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. More clues began to surface. A fresco uncovered beneath plaster in the eastern corridor revealed an illustration of Saturn, ringed not with mythic serpents or divine halos, but mathematical arcs. The paint had faded, but the structure was evident. Angular deviation, plotted curves, lunar paradox. What stunned the team wasn't just the content, it was the style. The brushstrokes were small, delicate, too delicate for the wide calloused hands of court artists accustomed to painting battles and processions. They belonged to a woman, later. Carbon testing dated the fresco to around 1048. It coincided exactly with the period in which Lubna and Samira had last been referenced in foreign correspondence. One letter, written by a physician in Palermo, described a celestial woman in the Western Kingdom whose instruments see what the eye cannot. A celestial woman, some had scoffed, assuming metaphor. They didn't anymore. In Rome, a scroll was recovered from a private estate. It had been catalogued incorrectly in the late 19th century as poetry. But when reviewed by a linguist who had spent her youth reading old Arabic folk songs, she realized the rhythm didn't fit a love ballad. It followed another pattern and algorithmic cadence. Each stanza corresponded to a lunar phase, each rhyme an angular correction. It was not a song, it was code, a disguised transmission of astronomical data, hidden in verse to escape religious scrutiny. The author never named themselves, but slipped a small rose beside the title, the same blossom symbol found in Istanbul, in Cairo. It was Samira's, back in the observatory. Layla began a side project, recreating the instruments once described in the lost writings, using brass, cedar, and old blueprints. She fashioned a model of an equatorium, a tool for predicting planetary positions. What surprised her was not its complexity, but its elegance. The gears moved in smooth harmony. The discs were interlocked in layers, each calibrated to anticipate the retrograde motion of Mars. And when she calibrated it against modern data, the readings fell within astonishing accuracy. It wasn't a prototype, it was mastery. But mastery kept quiet in those years. The scholars of al-Andalus had to walk lightly. With every dynasty shift, every wave of orthodoxy or war, the freedom to explore shifted like sand beneath their feet. So they adapted. They masked their discoveries in allegory, encrypted numbers in floral motifs, buried equations in illuminated margins. They built their telescopes in disguise and watched the heavens while pretending to debate theology. It was a dangerous dance, and yet they danced it anyway, because truth, once glimpsed, does not let go. The scroll of Tariq al-Kawakib had now been fully digitized. Translations appeared in 6 languages, yet each time it was read, it offered something new. Not just data or diagrams, but tone, voice. You could hear the camaraderie in its pages, the shared awe, the small disagreements smoothed over with affectionate quips. One section read, Samira insists Venus is off course. Yuya blames the instrument. Lubna laughs and blames them both. It wasn't just science, it was a family, bound not by blood, but by curiosity. They had met under arches of ivory and marble, hands ink-stained, robes slightly burnt from candle drift, eyes tired from night watching, but always watching. They knew the risks. They knew they would not be remembered as loudly as kings or warriors, but they also knew the stars remembered in their own way, not with applause, but with echoes. And those echoes had begun to wake in classrooms from Jakarta to Montreal. Children now study the work of Lubna and her companions. Their names appear on equations, on craters mapped by satellites, on textbooks whose covers no longer belong only to Newton or Kepler. Their methods are taught not as relics, but as living roots. And somewhere in Morocco, an old woman hums a melody passed down by her grandmother, unaware that it once held the coordinates of a comet's passing. They are no longer forgotten. They are folded into the sky. In Cordoba, at the spring solstice, people gather now not for spectacle, but for silence. As the sun passes its apex and floods the observatory courtyard with golden light, a hush falls. Children trace planetary arcs in sand trays. Elders close their eyes, remembering the names their ancestors were not allowed to speak aloud. And if you stand still, if you listen with the ears of history and the patience of stone, you can feel them. The rustle of a scroll being unrolled, the click of brass gears settling into place, the quiet breath of Lubna, steadying her hand as she draws the orbit of Jupiter, the starlit hush of Samira whispering a correction, Yahya muttering a prayer, not for success, but for clarity. They are there, always, not in the monuments, but in the moonlight, not in textbooks, but in telescopes held by small hands, in sketches drawn on napkins, in the moment someone looks up, not for answers, but for awe, because their greatest gift was not the data they left behind, it was the wonder, and that wonder endures patient, precise, and waiting like the stars themselves. Even silence carries memory. In Cordoba, as the nights grew longer and cooler, the observatory's walls absorbed the calm of the sky. The stars returned with familiar rhythm, casting silver patterns over tiled roofs and olive groves. Once, those same constellations had been charted by forgotten hands. Now, centuries later, they shone over instruments restored, manuscripts reopened, and questions once again dared to be asked. The observatory no longer stood as a mere artifact of the past. It had become a place of living remembrancer, sanctuary where history and curiosity met under moonlight. The brass astrolabes gleamed again. The solar discs turned with purpose. The great cedar doors creaked open each morning and lingered open, well into the night, as if unwilling to miss even a moment of stargazing. Layla had become its quiet guardian, not out of duty, out of devotion. She no longer needed charts to follow the stars. She had memorized their names, their movements, their moods. She could feel the approach of an eclipse in the way the wind changed tone against the high arches. She knew when a forgotten diagram would resurface by the subtle scent of must clinging to a just-unsealed scroll. Her work was not solitary anymore. One night, just past the new moon, a boy arrived. He looked no older than 12, slight, solemn, and observant. His name was Marwan. He had travelled for days with a satchel full of dog-eared notebooks and a wooden protractor tied with string. He didn't come to ask for knowledge. He came to confirm what he already believed, that someone before him had seen the sky, the same way he did. Layla didn't ask many questions. She offered him a seat beside her as she transcribed old texts, and he watched quietly for hours. His fingers moved constantly, sketching instruments, copying angles, mapping the stars overhead by memory, and then, softly, As if unsure whether the world deserved an answer, he asked, "Why did they stop?" Layla looked up from her work. "Who?" she asked, though she already knew. He didn't hesitate. "Lubna, Samira, the ones who started this." She paused, set her quill down gently. For a moment, all that could be heard was the rustle of parchment, and the distant hoot of an owl echoing through the stone. "They didn't stop," she said at last. "They were interrupted." And she told him the truth, not the official version, not the sanitized account, but the real one, about how knowledge had once been worshipped, then feared, how scholars had built observatories with their own hands, only to see them burned by conquerors who didn't understand what they saw, about scrolls hidden under floorboards, notes disguised as poetry, telescopes taken apart and passed off as musical instruments, about how silence was not always chosen. Sometimes it was survival. Marwan didn't ask more, but later that night, while the lanterns burned low, he opened his notebook and began drawing, not just stars, but faces, names, equations he didn't fully understand yet but felt drawn to. He copied curves and angles whispered of in books long out of print. In the hush of that night, one more mind joined the silent lineage, and elsewhere, the story stirred in Cairo. An old linguist finally deciphered a marginal note on a tattered manuscript, revealing coordinates to a comet once thought misjotted. In Samarkand, a schoolgirl named Amina traced diagrams from her grandfather's library and discovered a forgotten eclipse prediction buried in a Sufi poem. In Granada, a ceramicist etched astrolabe patterns into his latest bowl knot for function, but remembrance, no one called it a movement. It had no manifesto, but it grew, slow and steady, across time zones and borders. The astronomers of Andalusia were not resurrected with trumpets and banners, but through careful hands, whispered stories, and drawings in the margins of modern lives, barking Cordoba. A new scroll was added to the collection. It wasn't written in the elegant calligraphy of the Golden Age. It was stitched in simple cotton, the ink slightly smudged. It held translations from Tunis, reflections from Layla, diagrams from Marwan, and annotations sent by strangers who had never met, but understood each other perfectly. There was no author name, just a title, "Stars We Found Again," no one claimed. Credit, no one sought glory. They only wanted to contribute to carry the sky forward, one chart, one whisper, one constellation at a time, because knowledge, once planted, does not wither. It waits, and when it blooms again, it carries with it not just facts or theories, but memories. Memories of women who sketched Saturn in silence, of men who built armillary spheres under threat of exile, of students who read by candlelight, believing their questions mattered, even when no one else did. If you stand beneath the night sky in Cordoba now, you can feel them, not just the stars, but the ones who once named them, studied them, loved them, not just in history books, but in the chill before dawn, in the soft clicking of restored instruments, in the gaze of a young boy drawing galaxies he has never seen, but already knows. They are still here, not as ghosts, as guides. The air in the observatory had begun to change, not in temperature, but in feeling something subtle, something ancient, like a thread being pulled through time. There was no sound to mark it, no flash or sudden gust, only a growing sense that the past was closer now than it had ever been. The candles flickered with more urgency. The pages of open scrolls rustled even without wind. Layla noticed it in the way her footsteps echoed. Marwan noticed it in the stillness that followed. Outside, Cordoba moved as always. Bells rang softly in distant churches. The stone lanes bore the hush of late evening. But within the observatory, the silence deepened, not empty, but full of memory, full of return. Marwan had changed too. He was no longer just a guest or a student. He had grown into the space. His once shy glances had become steady, and his notebook, once neat and spare, now bulged with copied charts, annotated diagrams, and folded slips of older wisdom sent from strangers across continents. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with purpose. One night, as he stood beneath the great dome, tracing the orbit of a star with his finger, he whispered, "They're starting to remember." Layla turned toward him, brows gently raised. "The world," he said, "it's remembering them." She didn't smile, but she didn't need to. Her silence was agreement. All around them, signs had emerged. Letters had begun arriving from places Layla had never expected to reach. A handwritten note from Granada enclosed an old poem that referenced Lubna's calculations. A librarian in Marrakesh had uncovered a small box of astronomical sketches hidden inside the lining of a centuries-old prayer rug. A girl in Uzbekistan sent a scanned page of her great-grandmother's diary, filled with notes on Venus's phases, written in symbols that matched those on Samira's original manuscript. It wasn't a revival, not in the way textbooks would one day define it. It was a remembering, quiet, steady, humble, the way roots grow beneath frost. Even the instruments responded. The old armillary sphere, untouched for decades, began turning more smoothly. The bronze disc they had long thought merely decorative turned out to be an early solar clock, coded with verses from lost Andalusian songs. When Marwan rubbed ash and vinegar over its surface, the inscriptions revealed themselves in soft golden glints. Under moonlight, more children began arriving, not in droves, not in fanfare, but one by one. A brother and sister from Fez, carrying their uncle's hand-stitched star maps. A young deaf girl from Damascus, who traced constellations with her fingertips and communicated in signs that felt older than language. A shy boy from Istanbul who had memorized the movements of Mars before he could read. Each brought something, a scroll, a tale, a question, and each left something behind, a thought, a sketch, a connection. Layla watched them come, not as a leader but as a witness. She no longer needed to guide. The observatory had become its own teacher. The space itself whispered to those who entered with open minds. It hummed beneath the weight of curiosity. Its stones remembered footsteps long past. Its glass windows refracted starlight into patterns only the patient could follow. One evening, the wind carried something different. A sound, faint, rhythmic. Not music, not speech, but something in between. It came from a box tucked away in the western chamber, an old phonograph, untouched for over a century. When Marwan placed the needle, a voice emerged, cracked and distant. A woman's voice, speaking in classical Arabic. She wasn't teaching, she was remembering. She told of a night spent under Saturn, of a discovery made while everyone else slept, of laughter echoing through tiled halls, and of the way starlight used to fall across Lubna's writing desk like a blessing. It wasn't a lecture. It was a lullaby. The children listened, gathered, cross-legged on the floor, wide-eyed. Even the air seemed to still, allowing her voice to echo more clearly, as if the observatory itself wanted to listen. When the voice faded, no one spoke, stepped forward and placed her palm on the phonograph's casing. It was warm, alive, almost. Another memory returned. They began to write again. not just notes, but reflections, dreams, letters addressed to those long gone. Pages pinned to the walls carried messages like, "We found your chart. We finished your equation. We remember you." And at the heart of it all, a new scroll began to take form. Not sealed in silk, not bound in gold. Just paper and ink passed from one hand to another, collecting stories like the sky collects stars. They called it the Spiral Journal. It had no rules, no author, no deadline. It only asked one thing, that each person leave something behind for the next, a calculation, a story, a thought about the stars, a hope. They left it open on a stone pedestal at the center of the dome. Even visitors began to add entries, tourists who never expected to find themselves swept into memory. Architects who felt patterns in the ceiling mirror those of constellations. Poets who sat in the shadows and wrote verses by lantern light. One night, long after the children had gone to bed, Marwan sat beside Layla and asked, "Do you think they know?" She looked at him. "Them," he said. "Lubna, Samira, Yahya, do you think they know we're still listening?" Layla looked up through the dome. The stars shimmered back in perfect silence. "They knew," she said. "That's why they wrote it down." And above them, across centuries and forgotten empires, the stars continued their quiet rhythm and changed, unbothered and ever watching, ready to guide again, ready to be. Read. There are moments in history that never announce themselves. They arrive without ceremony, without trumpets or declarations. They step softly through doorways cracked open by quiet persistence. They grow not from revolutions, but from repetition. One hand copying a page, one child looking up, one whisper passed down beneath layers of time. That winter, the observatory was quieter than usual. Rain came often, drumming lightly against the domed ceiling, sliding down the glass in slow rivulets. Outside, the orange trees dropped their fruit early, and the hills wore mist like a shawl. The city slowed. But within the stone walls of the observatory, things were shifting deeply, slowly, like the plates of the earth beneath the stars they studied. Layla spent more time alone again, though not from loneliness. Marwan had taken a journey and invitation from a library in Istanbul, where a collection of untranslated manuscripts awaited anyone with patience and a good eye for obscure Andalusian shorthand. He had hesitated to go, but Layla had only smiled and handed him her travel cloak. "Go," she'd said. "The sky isn't just above us." He'd left with his notebook, 3 scrolls, and a folded paper star that one of the younger children had slipped into his bag when no one was looking. So she stayed, and the observatory breathed. It wasn't still. Stillness implies absence. But it was quiet in a way that meant listening. Every night, as she lit the oil lamps, Layla felt the air hum differently. The brass sextants caught reflections from the flames, and the great astrolabe on the western wall once silent began to tick faintly. A rhythm no one remembered it having before. The spiral journal continued to grow. Visitors came, some expected, some not. One night, a man from Mali arrived, older than most, with a walking stick carved with constellations. He said little, but when he saw the ceiling mural, his face changed not in awe, but in recognition. "My grandmother," he murmured, "used to tell stories about stars with those names." He stayed only one night, but before he left, he added, "A passage to the journal. It was not a story, but a song, written in a dialect few still knew." Layla didn't need to translate it. The rhythm said enough. Others followed. A group of young women from the Canary Islands who had traced their ancestry to North African astronomers, a French archivist who had found Samira's annotations hidden beneath layers of ink in a monastery's forgotten copy of Ptolemy's Almagest, a boy from Lahore who brought a copy of his grandmother's night sky calendar, passed down in fragments through decades of exile. Each visitor brought something, and the observatory grew, not in stone or size, but in gravity. It became a place to return to, even for those who had never been there before, a center not of empire, but of memory. One evening, as Layla was arranging a new set of star maps from Cairo, she heard the bells, soft at first, almost imagined, then clearer, not city bells, not church bells. These were older, tuned for the ears of those who listened carefully. They rang once, then again, 7 times in total. The brass doors at the observatory's southern hall creaked open. No one stood there, but on the marble just beyond the threshold lay a box, wooden, unmarked, tied shut with copper wire. Layla knelt beside it. She did not open it immediately. Some things are not rushed. She carried it inside and placed it beneath the great dome. There, surrounded by the voices of the past and the light of oil lamps flickering with curiosity, she untied the wire. Inside were scrolls. Not ancient, not pristine. They bore signs of long travel water stains, worn edges, folds smoothed and refolded 100 times. But the handwriting was careful, delicate, familiar. She pulled one free and recognized the curvature of the script. It was Marwan's, but these were not his notes. They were letters. He had not only translated the Istanbul manuscripts, he had traced their lineages. Each scroll included not just observations, but names of mothers, teachers, translators, scribes. Notes on where each passage had lived, which border it had crossed, which language had sheltered it. He had mapped knowledge not by what it said, but by how it survived. And there, at the bottom of the box, was a sealed envelope. Layla hesitated, only briefly before opening it. Inside, a single page, and a drawing. The page read, "They called her the woman who knew the sky." But she knew more than that. She knew the paths of those who carried it. "I followed them. I'll bring more." The drawing was a new chart, part constellation, part genealogy. Arcs connected names to places. Symbols marked stories. It wasn't complete. It wasn't meant to be. That night, Layla added a new page to the spiral journal. She wrote nothing. She only pasted Marwan's chart in the center and drew a quiet circle around it, like a compass. Around that page, the next dozen entries bloomed outward. The observatory had become more than a place of stars. It had become a map of voices, not just those who had once studied the sky, but those who chose to remember them. The astronomers had returned, not in flesh, but in form. Not in title, but in tone. In whispers, in echoes, in echoes, in ink, and high above. The stars continued their patient turning, as if waiting to see what would be written next. Some endings feel like silence, others like a breath held too long. But the true end of a story, the kind that matters, is rarely loud or certain. It moves like shadow at dusk, soft, gradual, patient. Not a falling curtain, but a shift in light. Not a farewell, but a return to stillness. And in Cordova, in the observatory built on centuries of dust and wonder, the end did not come with the closing of a door, but with the lifting of a gaze. Spring had returned. The air smelled of orange, blossom, and warm earth. The trees swayed gently in the courtyard, and the fountain restored stone by stone sang again. The observatory no longer whispered, it spoke in full voice, carried by the footsteps of children, scholars, wanderers, and the echo of questions older than language itself. Layla stood beneath the central dome one last time. Her hair was streaked with silver now, though her posture had not changed. She still wore the same long robes, still marked her notes in the same careful hand. But her silence had deepened not from weariness, but from fullness. She had become what the observatory needed, not a keeper, not a guide, but a vessel through which memory could pass uninterrupted around her. The space had transformed. The spiral journal had grown into a living archiver, woven tapestry of ink and time. New shelves lined the walls, filled not with relics, but with offerings. A carved, or from Zanzibar, a scroll wrapped in banana leaf from Kerala, a glass globe etched with constellations using obsidian needles sent from the Navajo Nation. Each artifact came with a story, and each story was marked with a symbol, not a signature, but a star. And then, one morning, the bells rang again, not 7 times, not for her, but 9. The doors opened, and Marwan stepped through. He was no longer a boy. His frame had grown broad, his steps sure. His eyes carried the weight of distances crossed, pages translated, names remembered. Behind him walked other students from Istanbul, archivists from Aleppo, a blind astronomer from Fez who had mapped the night sky through music. They had come to take their place, not to replace Layla, but to continue her. She greeted him without surprise. "You found the rest," she said. Marwan nodded, and from his satchel he drew a small case. Inside, a fragment of parchment, unassuming, faded, but unmistakable. It was one of Lubna's lost diagrams, the one with no title, no measurements, only a spiral drawn in a single stroke, unbroken from edge to edge. Layla reached out, touched it, lightly with her fingertips, and smiled. They placed it at the center of the dome that evening. As dusk bled into the horizon, Layla climbed the narrow staircase to the roof. The observatory had always offered the best view, but the roof held something else: distance. From up there, the city faded into pattern. Minarets and rooftops glowed in amber light. The river shimmered like a silver thread stitched through an old tapestry. She looked to the sky. It was clear, wide, endlessly indifferent, and yet intimately familiar. And then, as the wind swept gently across the rooftops, she whispered the names one last time: Lubna, Yahya, Samira, Zain, Idris, Amina. The stars did not respond. They never had to. They simply shone. She left the observatory at dawn, without ceremony. No announcements, no plaques, just a note left on her desk. What we see above is not separate from what we carry within. The stars were never far. They only waited for us to remember. In time, the observatory became more than a building. It became a seed. Other centers bloomed across the world, linked by shared texts, shared questions, shared silence. In Santiago, a dome mirrored Cordoba's design. In Samarkand, a student wrote new charts using Lubna's numerals. In Marrakesh, an entire school was named after the forgotten astronomers. And in Cordoba, children now lay on the marble floor at night, pointing upward, naming stars once lost to translation. They did not know the names of those who built the foundation. They only knew that when they looked up. The sky looked back, centuries ago. A woman with ink-stained hands wrote a question in the margin of a scroll. If we vanish, will the stars forget us? The answer came not in words, but in rhythm, in persistence, in the hum of telescopes tuned to ancient equations, in the curve of a sextant forged in homage, in the soft gasp of a child seeing Saturn's rings for the first time, in the way that human heart, for reasons it cannot always name, continues to look up. No, the stars do not forget. They wait, and now, finally, so many generations later, we have begun to answer them, not with conquest, not with silence, but with wonder, with reverence, and with a single, undeniable truth: we were always meant to remember, and now we do.